So jumping back into the book of Hebrews, there's this two big theological words, and we've used them before. Number one is orthodoxy, which everyone went, or? That's a big, basically means like the right beliefs. And so a lot of Christian churches, a lot of people, we teach from the Bible because we want you to have the right beliefs. Another big word is orthopraxy. And so that's the right practices, doing the right things. And so you kind of have to have right beliefs in order to live right generally, because, right action flows from right belief and how you understand things. So I can't say, I love my kids or I love my wife, and I can post online, but then ignore them. Like there's a connection. You believe thing. If you really believe it, it affects how you act. So I don't say I love my kids and never spend time with them. I don't say I love my wife and never spend time with her. It's a right belief, right action. Belief and action have to line up. Now, so Hebrews is an interesting book because we've been in this, how many weeks? Let's see, this is week 27 if I'm counting right. Every once in a while, I'm off a week, like I skip a week, or I have 2 week 26s. You never know when that's going to happen, and then I don't usually set myself straight to the end, and I'm like, why do I have 2 week 20? Anyway, so we're at week 27 of Hebrews, and we'll be here for a few more weeks. And it sort of turns the page, because the first 12 chapters were pretty heady and theological. And so there was a lot of things, there are great things explaining how we brought from death to life, how we had, Jesus is the great high priest. It's really important. And then as with most of the letters in the New Testament, the last part gets super practical. Because if we believe these things to be true, if we know these truths, then how do you live? How do we live it out? And so jumping into, as we turn the page into, or, scroll the page if you're reading digitally, or just look up and read it, I don't know. Hebrews chapter 13, we're going to jump into verse 1. It says, keep on loving each other as brothers and sisters. Don't forget to show hospitality to strangers. For some who have done this have entertained angels without realizing it. Remember those in prison as if you were there yourself. Remember also those being mistreated as if you felt their pain in your own bodies. So keep on loving each other as brothers and sisters. Now what does that mean? It means they're already doing it, right? And so they were already doing it, but sometimes we need a reminder, sometimes we need encouragement. So keep loving. I think about it like marriage. Now, if you've ever been married, or if you're going to get married, generally, I always give people marriage advice, and I do premarital counseling, and then we've, since our kids were little, we've been kind of, sort of shaping and helping them understand, this is the kind of person you should marry. We actually picked out their spouses when they were young. We just haven't told them yet. No, I'm kidding. We haven't done that. But some cultures do. Works out. I had a friend in seminary that, he'd never met his wife. He only, wrote emails and long letters to her, and then they met, and they were very much in love. So anyway, different cultures, different things. He was Indian. Now, so marriage, you tend to want to marry someone that you like being around. That's one of my biggest things. You want to marry someone you're friends with, someone that you don't have to oh gosh, I got to spend time with her. But here's the thing: most of us, in marriage, you have to work at it. Because if you're not careful, you don't always want to spend time with that person later on, right? A wedge can divide you, things, and you're because the thing that you're she's so different than me. I love that about her. And before you know it, you're she's so different. I hate that. Most of us have to work at keeping. And so I think a lot of times when we talk about relations in church, we talk about loving brothers and sisters in the fellowship, sometimes you have to work at it. Because you're not always going to be super happy with one another if you really have community and connection with people. It says, and loving each other, and I just got to tell you, the word, the Greek word here is phileo, and I always think of, when I think of phileo, not filet-o-fish, but now some of you are thinking about fish, but I think of Philadelphia. I'm going to give a shout out to the Philadelphians because, Philadelphia is phileo adelphos, meaning, brotherly love. It's, not always a city known for it, but, Philly loves the Eagles. Philly loves soft pretzels. So you got to love each other like Philly loves the Eagles, right? You got to, love it. And, the thing about being in the faith, being believers, is that Jesus gives us some instructions about who we're supposed to love in a couple places, but I'm going to jump into Matthew chapter 12, and Jesus is talking to the crowd. His mothers and brothers are standing outside asking to speak to him because they were a little kind of like, Mom and the bros weren't so sure Jesus was doing, like, they're like, okay, we know you're kind of special, but not that special. We're not so sure. Your cause not. And so there's sort of a, hey, we're coming to get you sort of thing. And Jesus, someone tells Jesus, hey, your mom and brothers are standing outside, and they want to speak to you. And Jesus said, who is my mother? Who are my brothers? Then he pointed at his disciples and said, look, these are my mother and brothers. Anyone who does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother. And so there's something about when you're a believer and a follower of Jesus, it makes us family. It's a new kind of, it doesn't mean you have to get rid of the old family, but there's obligations to one another. Jesus said this in John 13, he says, so now I'm getting, I think I've read this recently, to you guys. So now I'm giving you a new commandment. Love each other just as I have loved you. You should love each other. Your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples. And so the hallmark, if you will, the defining value for what it means to be a believer and follower in Jesus, sometimes, like what people should see is love. Not, do you have the right bumper stickers? I remember one time an evangelist kind of guilted me into buying a bumper sticker, and then I went out and I looked at my car. I'm like, I'm not putting a bumper sticker on my... Anyway, not by our politics, and not by the T-shirts we wear, it's not by the things we, Facebook like. I always hate those, like, if you love Jesus, you'll like and share this. I'm like, I'm pretty sure Jesus isn't up there in heaven going, oh, I thought he loved me, but he didn't share that on Facebook. They're usually very cheesy things too. But we're called to love people like we love family. Now, for some of us, that might be more difficult, right? Because we're thinking, man, you don't know my family. I'll love you like I love my family. Maybe love one another like family should love one another. Family can get on each other's nerves. I mean, think about it, everyone has that one relative at Thanksgiving that's hard to love. Think of that person. If you're not thinking of someone, it's probably you. Just kidding. In that, it can be difficult. It's easy to kind of talk about community. It's easy to talk about love. It's a little harder sometimes to spin out and do it because y'all annoy me. I'm kidding. Because sometimes we can get on each other's nerves. Church family can get on your last nerve. Loving people can be challenging, but still it's this command. Jesus commanded. The writer of Hebrews commands it. We're supposed to love each other. So big question is, are we loving people like Jesus loves people? Because it's easier to sort of do the opposite and just love people who love me. Like if you love me some Jeff, I love me some Jeff. Like we can all love Jeff, But it's hard sometimes to love some people that maybe don't even love you, right? It's kind of love me, I'll follow. It's like you follow me on Twitter, I'll follow you on Twitter. You follow me on Instagram, I'll follow you. It's like there's a reciprocity. Like, you guys remember these things called Christmas cards? Did anybody do Christmas cards? I got a couple here. Okay. I didn't get one from any of you. No. Yes, I did. You didn't get one from me. Like I remember our first year of marriage. Our first year of marriage, we were doing the adult thing and sending out Christmas cards. And then the second year, we moved from Pittsburgh to Los Angeles, and we sent them out in January because we were just there was so much. We're like, hey, we're celebrating Orthodox Christmas, y'all. But it was great because we knew who had sent us cards at that point, and we could send them because there's a reciprocity, right? You feel bad if someone sends you a Christmas card and you don't get one, you didn't get them one. Now, if you sent me one, I love you guys, and I read it. Probably got them up in my office still, but I'm just terrible at doing that stuff because there's and so it's easy to love people who love you if there's this reciprocity, but we have to love everyone and love our brothers and sisters even if they annoy us. It says, don't forget to show hospitality to strangers, for some who have done this have entertained angels without realizing it. And this is kind of one of those verses, the first time you read it, you're like, seriously? Did I just kind of had someone over for dinner, bought someone a sandwich at Wawa, and then like maybe they were really an angel. And so then I'm thinking, the dude that talked to me at Harbor Freight the other day, like, should I have bought him a sandwich? And because I didn't have any cash on me, was it an angel? And I missed out. I don't know. Some of you are like, what were you buying in Harbor Freight? Tools, you know that. But I bought a cool tool on sale. There was a sale. Anyway, I think the story that kind of, I think makes sense of this too, is Abraham and angels. So if you read Genesis 18, there's this wealthy old Abraham, the kind of these angels show up, and he just thinks they're people, and he could have had servants get food. Instead, Abraham, well, it's funny, he's like, let me feed you, and then he runs in and says, Sarah, make bread. Because immediately Sarah had, things added to her task list, which I thought was hilarious. I noticed that today. It's like Abraham feeds, but he goes in and tells her to make bread. He goes out and like kills stuff though, like kills like an animal so they can eat and everything, and it's sort of, they make this meal, and I kind of wonder how hospitality was a lot harder back then, right? Like, we're like, oh, hospitality, let me go get you a sandwich. We're not like, oh, I got to go kill the animal and I got to bake the bread. I mean, this would have taken like a little bit of time, right? And so he serves them the best he has. And this is the story, too. If you remember a little while ago, we talked about Sarah laughs and everything in this. And so there's this, Abraham doesn't realize that he's entertaining angels, like he's entertaining divine beings. He's entertaining God, and so there's hospitality is a big deal in the ancient world. Like being hospitable was like not being hospitable was a super huge bad no-no, and so now hospitality, we kind of think of like. It's, having people over for dinner or something. And again, especially it's like if they had you over for dinner, then you have them over for dinner. We tried that group for one time. We only got through one group. It was like we were going to rotate dinners. So thanks for the dinner. I still haven't had you over. I probably owe you. You guys remember that? Anyway, they're like, yes, we've been waiting for our invitation. But here, let me drop some Luke on you. Luke 14, Jesus says this, he turns to his host, he says, when you put on a luncheon or banquet, he said, don't invite your friends or brothers or relatives and rich neighbors, for they will invite you back and that will be your only reward. Instead, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. Then at the resurrection of the righteous, God will reward you for inviting those who could not repay you. So sometimes, it's not just, hospitality isn't just like treating someone hospitable who's treated you hospitable, like in this reciprocal thing, but a lot of times it means being hospitable, being loving, being kind, to people who can't pay you back. Matthew 25, Jesus says, he's talking about the time of the judgments, then the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the creation of the world. For I was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you invited me into your home. I was naked and you gave me clothing. I was sick and you cared for me. I was in prison and you visited me. And they're like, Lord, when did we ever do all this? That's a paraphrase. And then the king will say, I tell you the truth, when you did it to one of the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you were doing it to me. And so the Christian life, in part, is about serving other people, loving other people, often people who can't kind of give anything back to you. And so hospitality may look a lot less like a reciprocal dinner invitation and more like caring for people who need caring. Prison. Most of you know, I spent a fair amount of time in prison when I was younger, visiting people who were there. Pastor joke. I remember every time I got out, I would put something on Facebook, out of prison finally. I remember one time I was visiting somebody in prison, and for some reason they put me in the section where you talk to your lawyer instead of the regular visitor session, and they kind of forgot about us. And there was no clock, and so you're there, and it's like I had run out of stuff to talk to this person with. We talked about everything we could think of. Unfortunately, it was a lot of times it was kids who used to be in my youth group, and they were in prison, so I would go see them. I was a bad youth pastor, apparently. but I remember I was in there, and I was like, man, this has been forever. And finally, we got a guard's attention. They let me out. I'd been in there for hours. They just forgot about me that I was visiting this person. Anyway, I got out of that day, I was so hungry. Anyway, but you visit people, it's good, you do good. But here's the thing, often you feel forgotten when you're in prison because everyone else goes about life, right? I write some people, I try to, I'm not always the best pen pal. I need to if I get the physical letter, I have to write back then, because then I forget. But you get forgotten. Remember those in prison as if you were there yourself. Also those being mistreated. Now, there's I think there's kind of a similar category, because prisoners were often mistreated. And Christians were sometimes imprisoned. It's sort of these categories sort of overlap, if you will. And a kind of reminder, back in Hebrews 11:36 says some were jeered at, their backs were cut open and whips, others were chained in prison. So the fact is, people were often, and the book of Hebrews was specifically written to some Christians who were going through a rough time. They were going through some bad things, persecution. And so the truth is, life is not always easier as a Christian. Now, I do think there's a lot more joy, but not everything. There's a lot more joy. We have joy here. Anyway, a lot more joy. There's a lot more hope, but life's not always, easier. Sometimes it becomes more complicated, but I think it's more purposeful, more hopeful, even during trials. But trials will often come our way when we believe. And so a lot of times the people in prison would be the people you're visiting. Are the people, hey, don't forget about these brothers and sisters, really kind of connects back to that first verse, that are locked up. And often, ancient prison, it's funny, if you Google this, you get all kinds of things. But, our prison system, I think because we're Americans and we've sort of seen the prison system kind of work in one way, that you kind of think that's the way it is around the world. Prison systems have been very different around the world and very different historically. I remember I had friends who would sneak up to the one down by by Spence's Sale, and the guys would be giving them money to go run out and buy stuff. I had a friend who just took the money and ran, but he's a bad person. Anyway, point being is, it's kind of I was trying to think what would it be like to visit prisoners or to provide for their needs, which would have been in each world. It's do you deposit money on their commissary? Some of you know what I mean. Some of you don't have any friends in prison. I don't know if that's good or bad. Anyway, remember those being mistreated as if you felt their pain in your own bodies. Now, I'm thinking about this. Paul uses the metaphor of the body when he talks about people, right? We're all members of one body. And I was thinking about this. Has anyone ever caught on fire? Okay, growing up, they always tell you stop, drop, and roll. I've caught on fire at least once, maybe twice. And what I didn't stop, drop, and roll, which was kind of funny because I was I'm on fire. Or one time I was working in the chemical lab, and I was working with some very, very strong bases. They were thumping. No, different kind of bass. And this flask, I was mixing up something really strong because we were doing some testing, and the flask exploded, and I poured basically stuff that burned through my pants, was burning through my skin, and you're supposed to run over and pull the shower thing, and those of you flush your body, but it's hundreds of gallons come out when you pull that. So I didn't do that. But I trust me, when they're caught on fire, eventually I got the fire out. Don't worry, I didn't die. With the chemicals, I burned myself pretty bad because I waited till I got home, and by the time I got home, I was just Anyway, but I didn't ignore my leg on fire, did I? Why? Because you feel that. I didn't ignore, I think the same leg I poured acid on, or strong base. Why didn't I ignore it? Because it hurt. And if we're all part of one body, we can't just ignore somebody. You wouldn't get shot with an arrow and be arrow in my leg. I'll just go about my business, right? You would tend to it. And it's the same way. If we're members in one body, that means we love one another, we care for one another, and it means if we got an arrow sticking out, we got to tend to that. And so there's this responsibility we have to one another. It's easy to forget people when they're out of sight, but we have a responsibility. Lucian, who I know most of you are oh yeah, Lucian, I remember him. I read a lot of boring Greek stuff, but a lot of it's interesting too. But he was someone who sort of mocked Christians, but he kind of also had a respect for some of the things they did. And he records this about how some early Christians acted. He said, Christians did everything within their power to have Proteus Peregrinus released. I can't even say that. We're a protein dude. Okay, so protein released. And Proteus released. When that was impossible, they identified themselves with him in prison. The detail that certain leaders, after bribing the guards, slept inside the cell with him. That's pretty serious. That's visiting in prison. That's identifying yourself with, and it's kind of funny because sometimes the critics of Christianity really pointed out that the early church kind of took this stuff seriously. And they loved him so much, they went and hung out with him. Now, and we complain just going to prison. It is complicated in our system. So you may remember back to Hebrews 10, although it's been a while. I don't know what week we were on Hebrews 10, and then we had a summer series on Proverbs. Man, anyway, sometimes I'm like, oh, we just preached that book. And they're like, that was 3 years ago, because we've been in a couple other books since then. It says, you suffered along with those who were thrown into jail, and what all you owned was taken from you, accepted with joy. You knew there were better things waiting for you that will last forever. And so the letter of Hebrews is written to this persecuted church. Many were persecuted and imprisoned. And so, and so today in America, we don't often have our stuff like carried off and taken into prison. And most of us aren't like, oh, wait, you're a Christian? Let me take all your stuff. Like governments generally don't do that in the U.S. I think today in America, it often means more like you're skewered or canceled on social media. There's some times I want to say something. I was telling the guys about this one on Twitter the other day. I wanted to say something. This guy's actually a believer, but he's kind of injured by the church, because sometimes church people are the worst people sometimes, and sometimes the way we act to each other, sometimes we shoot our own wounded. And so he was kind of mad about something, and I think he misinterpreted a Hebrews verse, and I wanted to kind of, bring context to it, and I couldn't do it in 140 characters. I mean, it's taken me 27 weeks to get this far. Twitter's not made for people like me who just have to, I'd be one of those people that had, the 50 threads if you're on Twitter, and you're like, which part do I respond to, part 1 or part 100? Anyway, but, I always like that someone tagged me once in the Incredible Hulk guy, because, it's like the Incredible Hulk, but he had glasses and everything, and he cites references. And that's how I am. I tend to be like, well, actually. But then, anyway. But, you kind of, you don't want to, sometimes you express an unpopular opinion on something like Twitter, and you get, beat up, right? Like people just troll around looking for people to pick on, and and so sometimes if you have a Christian beliefs, you can be kind of marginalized and sort of pushed out. You might be mocked at work or even among friends. Not invited to social events. I had some friends who stopped inviting me around. Around the world, it often means worse things, though. Like we're sort of limited in our idea of persecution. Like I had a friend one time, they always complained about, oh, they're so persecuted at work. No, you were just on Facebook all the time instead of working, and that's why your employer was mad. But, persecution is a lot more serious around the world. Christians die for their faith all the time. We've talked about this, and Nasrani, and that's why the Arabic N, because people are kind of tagged as the Nazarenes, and there's persecution around the world. And I told you one time, I was chilling at the ballpark when my kids were little, and a friend of mine who actually came and spoke here at one point, he called me and he's like, we're talking like, what are you doing in the U.S.? You're back too soon. He's like, oh, I was beaten and thrown out of the country. And and he just kind of keeps moving, let's go back to that. What? I'm like, I feel bad. I'm chilling at the ballpark eating a hot dog and a snow cone, and people around the world are going through much more serious things, right? And if you kind of look worldwide, there is persecution, and that's kind of it's what they were going through. And as shocking as hard to hear, it shouldn't surprise us, because Jesus says in John 15, the world hates you. Remember that it hated me first. And then a slave is no greater than master. Since they persecute me, naturally they will persecute you. And so persecution happens. And so this is like a reminder to visit and care for those who are persecuted in prison, because that's what we do when we're family. Most of us wouldn't forget a family member there. And so even around the world, there's people who are persecuted for their faith. I often say, if you listen to me long, probably every sermon, if you're kind of newer, it's like I will drop live differently. That's kind of the way I've just been thinking about faith for a while now, is, we live differently, meaning that we live differently when Christ has come into our lives. It doesn't mean that we're made right by God by what we do, because there's this whole sin thing, and we all sin and fall short of the glory of God. We got this stuff we got to deal with, and there's forgiveness in Christ when we put our faith in him. So we're not kind of saved by our works. We're saved by God's grace alone when we come to him in faith. But it changes the way we live. Like, I don't live the same way. Ephesians chapter 2, we were talking about this in men's group yesterday, because we're kind of working through Ephesians, not as detailed as I can be sometimes, and we're using a fun video, kind of get a different perspective on some things. But Ephesians 2, 9 and 10, and if you're around here very long, I will quote Ephesians 2:10, right? Because we're God's workman. No one wants to say it out loud because they're like not sure they'll get it after all this time, and then you're like made fun of on the video later, Anyway, but Ephesians 2, 9 and 10 says this: salvation is not a reward for the good things we've done so that none of us can boast about it. So it's not like I'm good enough and God's like, that's my boy, we're adopting him. But, it's by God's grace alone. While we were enemies of God. It says, for we are God's masterpiece. He has created us anew in Christ Jesus so we can do the good things he has planned for us long ago. So we're not made right by what we do, but by what we do. But we will change what we do when we're right with God. And I think when we read this verse, we think of, we are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus to do good works. I quote different translations, because originally it was workmanship, and there's a great word in there, and actually the guy in the video brought it out. The word poema is and it means like it's where we get poem. And the idea is like we're God's masterpiece, we're his work of art. And so God, and I always think of it like a mosaic. Like, you ever been to see the chicken mosaics at the Blue Hen Mall? Like, are you really from Delaware if you haven't seen the chicken mosaics? Anyone not seen the chicken mosaics? We'll do a field trip. Some of you got, oh my gosh, have you at least seen the pictures I posted? You got to go see the chicken mosaics. Somebody grab these people afterwards, bring them out. You can go to Jake's, it's right there by the mall. You can kind of go in one of those exits or entrances. They're also entrances. And there's like these chicken mosaics. I love mosaics. They're like cracked, broken little pieces of pottery and stuff. They put them together and there's a blue hen. And if I could buy one of those, I would love to have that. To me, it's a work of art. One, because it's cool, because it's a chicken, and I grew up with chickens in the mall, like not real chickens, but these blue hen things. But I love it because it's also sort of, for me, mosaics are this image of God takes the brokenness, the jacked upness, and like the shattered pieces of things, he puts it together in this beautiful thing. Now, I think sometimes, we read this verse, we're thinking like we're looking for great, incredible things to do. And I do believe God calls some of us to do great and incredible things. But I think God also just calls us to do what's in front of us. And so sometimes it's just loving people. And it's funny because we just did the Firefly Project. And you see me on BOC? No, I was on a couple of different news things. And I was like, why do you interview me at the end of the day when I'm hardly coherent anymore? Interview me in the morning when I'm like fresh. I've been there all day. We had great help and everything. And it's kind of funny because a couple of us have been there since the original one, and they're always like, how long have you done it? And I'm like, I don't know. It's been a long time. And I'm like, I think we figured out it was like 8 or 9 years we've been doing it. The first time, it really was just a bunch of us heard there was stuff, and we went out there with trucks, and we picked up stuff, and we thought we'd picked up everything. We're like, oh my gosh, this is incredible. We had truckloads of stuff, and we worked a lot with homeless people because we were downtown and that there were homeless people. And so it didn't take like rocket science, like, look, here's somebody, they need help. Oh, look, here's free stuff. That's how I can help them. It wasn't this great thing. It was just pick up the stuff in front of you. Now, it did turn into a much bigger project. And now it's like we've got 130 volunteers, there's all kinds of businesses, laundry, sleeping bag, but it really just came from doing what's in front of you. And so much of the Christian life, living differently, just means doing what's in front of you. Are you going to love your brothers and sisters? Now, you can kind of do that hypothetically, it's people around the world and everything, or maybe it's just someone next to you now. Or if you're online, maybe it's someone next to you at home. I don't know. I don't know where you're watching from. But it's just doing the things you find to do. Living this Christian life. We live differently because we're made right with God. I love the book of James. I don't know, maybe we'll do it here again sometime. We've done it like in a Bible study. I don't always remember how many times I've taught books. I'm getting that old. I'm like, so I need to like go track myself in the spreadsheet. Sometimes I'm like, just preach that. And I have a spreadsheet actually, which I haven't updated in a while. But I go back and I'm like, oh, I preached that 6 years ago. So they know that already. I don't have to preach that again, right? Like you guys remember every message I've ever preached, right? I thought about doing a book one time. I was like thinking, and I was looked back, and I was like, oh, we did that book. Anyway, because I read the scripture all the time anyway. But, I love James, because James is sort of this cool book. It says, chapter 2, verse 14. So what good is it, dear brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith but don't show it by your actions? Can that kind of faith save anyone? Suppose a brother or sister has no food or clothing, and you say, goodbye, have a good day, stay warm and eat well, but you don't give that person food or clothing. What good does that do? You see, faith by itself isn't enough. Useless. Unless it produces good deeds, it is dead and useless. Now, somebody can argue, you have faith, others have good deeds. But I say, how can you show me your faith if you don't have good deeds? I will show you my faith by my good deeds. Now, theologians, they sit there and spend all this time. This is like the fun thing of like seminary, theological school. They sit there and argue things like, oh, well, I think Paul was contradicting James and all. Oh my gosh, it's like all the same stuff. You're saved entirely by grace, which is what Paul's emphasizing. But James is like, hey, but if you're saved, and Paul definitely does that, because his letters say, hey, this is how you live. But if you're saved by grace, you act differently. You live differently. Faith in Jesus moves us to do something. Now, I believe in a lot of things that don't change me, right? Like, I believe in George Washington. Anyone here believe in George Washington? A couple of you. Some of you are like, I don't know about that. What do you mean by believe? What do you mean by George Washington? How do I know he existed? Here's the thing. I believe in George Washington, but I'm not out planting or chopping down cherry trees, or wearing wooden teeth and attacking the British. There's things you believe that don't change you. But really understanding and believing in Jesus changes your heart. It changes your actions. It changes everything about who you are. Now, sometimes that's just kind of a nutshell and you're younger in your faith. But the more you grow in your faith, the more it just changes who you are. Because, faith whether it works is, it doesn't make sense. And so we're called to do these things. Faith in Christ moves us to engage and change the world. It's natural together. It's like peanut butter and jelly, right? It's like cheese and pizza, eggs and scrapple or bacon, syrup and pancakes, tikka masala and rice. Got a couple of, things just naturally go together. And if you hadn't had tikka masala and rice, you need to go to Kebab Corner today. And here's the thing. I think the cool thing about faith is, I was hoping somebody would wear a jersey today. We've got a couple of deep water jerseys. Anyone wearing a football jersey that I don't see? Usually, like on Sunday, I can, during the fall, oh, there we go. We got a second layer. It's like, usually there's Eagle fans, they got jerseys on or it's like, if your team's not doing too well, you're not wearing the jersey, like, you know what I mean? But, most of the time on Sunday, somebody will be wearing a jersey. And, and does that mean you're on the team? No, like it just means you like the team. Some of us want to be fans of Jesus. We want to get the jersey. We want to wear the shirt. But God calls us to be players. Not playa like that, but we're to be in on the team. We're on the team. We do the stuff. And so, what that looks like is, different through the stages. Because, when you're young and you got, lots of free time, man, you could just go around and be Jesus to people and have lots of time to do it. I had friends who were, young, and they had a big truck, and when it snowed, they just drove around and pulled people out of ditches because they could. And they were just, Jesus-loving dudes who weren't married and had a big truck. And, a great time. Now, it changes because then at some point you're married and you're being Jesus to your spouse and to other people, and you have little kids. It's like being and modeling Jesus for your kids and the way you love them. And so it changes throughout life, but we all get to be a part of this thing, and our life gets to change. I got so many things to think about this, but we only have so much time. When I look at, I spend a lot of time thinking about the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, and it's interesting when you look at the laws, and we were talking about some of that yesterday and how to interpret it, and there's all kinds of things. We've talked about this before, but a big concern of in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, is in part the law was given a lot of times to protect people. There was kind of this is how you're to treat people. This is how you're to, because they didn't want you to take advantage of and hurt people, because the world sometimes is a very unfair place. Because we're supposed to care for each other, we're supposed to love each other, and ultimately, when we live different, we care for those who are vulnerable. You know, Jesus. It's interesting, because I think sometimes we can be selfish naturally, and Jesus, he has this interaction. We've talked about it. Man asks him, what must I do? Jesus is like, what do you think? He said, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your strength, and all your mind. Love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus is like, right, good job. And the guy's like, hey, and so who is my neighbor? Because he wants to limit it, right? And Jesus tells this whole story, the parable of the Good Samaritan. You should listen to it. We don't have time to preach everything this morning. But because he says, hey, who's your neighbor? It's like, just go and be neighborly. Like go and live this faith out. And naturally, we can often try to limit our care and generosity. Jesus always expands it. Like, we always kind of want to go, okay, I just love these people. But Jesus widens it up. And Matthew 5 is one of my favorite verses out of one of my favorite books and in one of my favorite sections. If you hang out with me long, I've got a lot of favorite books. It's all wrapped up in this bestseller called the Bible, but there's a lot of good stuff in there. In Matthew 5, Jesus says, you are the light of the world, like a city on a hilltop that cannot be hidden. No one lights a lamp and puts it under a basket. Hide it under a bushel. No. Instead, a lamp is placed on a stand where it gives light to everyone's house. The same way, let your good deeds shine out for all to see, so that everyone will praise your heavenly Father.